Thanks, Helen. And I'm going to present some work today on some of the economic analysis that's fed into the Department of Ag and EPA-funded SeQUEsTER project. I'm going to start with these lines, which essentially describe the number of animal numbers and cattle over the last century. It's part of a history of Irish agriculture that I presented earlier in the year. The top line, with the numbers on the right of the graphic, represent the total number of cattle. And the bottom two lines, the red line, are dairy cattle, and the orange line are other cows. Dairy cows, there is a red line. So it started off around 4 million cattle back in the 20s. Didn't grow that much until the 50s. And then as the first subsidies came in the early 1960s, and as we anticipated joining the European Economic Community in the 70s, there was a strong increase in overall cattle numbers, particularly driven by the dairy sector. Historically, there were more dairy cows than suckler cows, and that ratio rose as we joined the EC with the anticipation of a free trade in dairy products. Once we joined the EC, there was a cattle crisis, and there was a fall off in numbers almost immediately, and then in total cattle. And then we had milk quota in 1984, which limited milk production, from which we saw a decline in the number of dairy cows. In parallel, there was the start of headage payments for suckler cattle. And into the 90s, we had the McSharry reforms, which drove on the total number of cattle up to a peak in 1998. And that was the highest number of cattle we ever had in the country. During that period, we saw the number of dairy cows and suckler cows converge to be about the same, of about 1 million. And that remained the case for the bones of a decade and a half. Into the 2005, there was decoupling. We saw a decline in numbers over the period since 1998 to a low point in 2011 after the financial crisis. And with the CAP health check and the loosening of milk quota and then its abolition in 2015, we saw a rapid takeoff in the dairy sector and a gradual decline in the number of suckler cows. And so it meant that our numbers of cattle are growing back up to the maximum number that we ever had, but it's not quite as high as 1998. This graphic is the number of cattle aged under 1, with the lighter green male and the darker green female going back over the last 40 years. And one of the challenges in reaching the target for 2030 is that the number of, potentially breeding animals, the female calves, is growing. It's continuing to grow, and it's now more than any point in the past, including the previous peak. The progeny of these animals will still be around in 2030, and so one of the challenges in making some of the climate action targets is that continued animal growth. Teagasc have prepared a roadmap they published in 2019, which classified a whole range of different mechanisms by which we could reduce greenhouse gas emissions in the agricultural sector. It's really a very important piece of work. And they classified measures into 4 potential sources of savings. The first, land use, for example, things like forestry, accounted for 45% of the potential reductions, and we'll come back to that in a later presentation. Energy in farms, such as bioenergy and so on, would account for 27%. The challenge with that under the current accounting rules is that savings made by farms in this area aren't counted as part of emissions within the sector. And it's important to recognize that agriculture delivers more than food, fiber, fuel, and feed. And so I think it's essential, if we want farmers to deliver on greenhouse gas emission reductions, that we find a way to measure and count everything that agriculture does. The other 2 areas fall within the area of agriculture, what are called agricultural technical measures. So things like improved fertilizer formulation, like protected urea, different feeds, the way we spread slurry, that can reduce the amount of emissions for doing the same thing, for having the same number of animals. That reduces about 17.5%. And the last area is known as efficiency. So these include things like animal breeding. Improved animal breeding means that you can produce the same amount of food with fewer animals. But that's a very important point. It's the same amount of food, but not necessarily the same amount of animals. And sometimes that's missed in public debate. Colleagues of mine in �々and in the University of Galway have undertaken a study looking at emissions over time in the agricultural sector. The red line, sorry, the blue line is the amount of animal emissions per unit of product. It's fallen over time as the efficiency of agriculture has improved, the carbon efficiency. So fewer emissions for the produce we produce. So that's a good trend. That's something we need to deliver on. And it's the focus of a lot of scientific investment by �々and in their extension activities. But the challenge is that the red line is going up, the amount of emissions from the sector. So that the increase in animal numbers is growing at a faster rate than we're improving the environmental efficiency of the sector. And that is a challenge in realizing the objectives we set ourselves in terms of reduced emissions. As an economist, more efficiency means that you get a higher return per animal, which from my perspective, particularly for the dairy sector, would mean a pressure to have more animals. If you could make more per animal, you will supply more animals, you will have more animals. So the question I would ask is that even if we can deliver lower emissions with the same amount of food, do we have the levers to realize those gains from efficiency? Jerry Boyle and the Food WISE 2030 Committee for Dairy proposed a retirement scheme that might enable that and a number of other measures. But we still have work to do in relation to doing this. In terms of comparing ourselves with other countries, we have a relatively efficient dairy sector amongst the lowest emissions in Europe. However, when you look at things in a different way, if you look at the different sectors in Ireland, we see that, and in other countries as well, that the emissions are higher for methane emitting sectors like dairy, sheep and beef relative to other sectors like poultry, fish and pigs and so on. So there are quite different emissions per product for different sectors. I did a study looking at the food harvest strategy in 2020. And the straight line is our target, and the individual lines are the progress towards the target. So with the top line, which is beef, we achieved that target early. The next line, the light green line, is milk. We achieved that early and exceeded both. But in the sectors which have lower emissions, like agriculture, we never hit the target. And for forestry, where we sequester carbon, we only once reached 50% of the target. So we were successful in delivering on the low carbon footprint, but not in the carbon sequestration. If we look to the past to see how do we farm in the past, this graphic describes the share of cattle, dairy, sheep, other animals and cereals. And up to the 50s, about 50% of our output came from sectors that didn't produce methane, that had lower emissions. That's grown to 75% today. So pigs, poultry and cereals are more important in the past. And the question I would ask is, do we want a different mix? Should that be part of the solution, that diversification point of view that we heard in the Slido poll? And one of the implications of that balance, that our focus on food production that is based upon ruminant animals that produce methane, is that when we look at the overall system, This graphic describes the agricultural productivity in the EU, so the euro of output per carbon production, and we have the highest carbon per unit output across the EU. My last two slides now look firstly upon the notion of farm viability and the question about a just transition. We've had very substantial growth since 2015 in the sector. Viability has declined of the whole overall sector. The dairy sector has much higher viability, but we see a worsening viability in the beef sector. So essentially, the gains we see for the sector as a whole have not been spread evenly across the sector. They've been primarily concentrated within the dairy sector. A question we have for policy is, how do we deliver economic gains from dairy while preserving the viability of the wider sector? How do we deliver that just transition? And again, there are some examples from Jerry Boyle's group and from Teagasc, things like emissions trading, from beef to allow for dairy expand and potentially find a win-win. So to conclude and to summarize, we see that improved carbon efficiency, and there are further opportunities that Teagasc and researchers are working on to improve the efficiency of the sector. However, the growth in animal numbers are coming faster than this efficiency growth. Do we have the levers to manage that and to deliver on the efficiency gains? And instead of focusing purely on animal changes, should we think of diversifying and learning lessons from the past? And finally, can we use novel instruments like emissions trading to facilitate just transitions and a more balanced benefit and cost across the sector? Thanks very much.